Hi, I'm Dr. AASHISH NEUPANE, a critical care physician here in Boca Raton, Florida.
Hi, my name is Bridget. I'm a physician assistant at Rush University Medical Center.
I'm Dr. Jeff Lay. I work at Maimonides Medical Center.
You know, as this whole world is facing this coronavirus pandemic situation, our experience has been quite shocking. You know, our observation has been a little bit different than what our Chinese folks have reported. You know, we're seeing a lot of patients who are very young, and they're coming quite frequently.
As the days progress, we are seeing a higher volume each day and each shift. People do seem to be getting sicker. However, there are still a fair number of people that are able to go home and safely self-isolate.
Morale takes a hit some days, but I think that everyone here has shown various levels of resilience, and I have a very tight-knit group of physicians and nurses and staff. We smile underneath our masks, and we try to pick each other up every day. How are you doing? How are you holding up? Stay safe. Like all the usual stuff that we've been saying, the colloquialisms these days. But we try to pick each other up, but it can be hard sometimes.
I think that even though being in a pandemic is a scary and very stressful situation, I do feel a lot more reassured because I know how prepared we are to see the worst.
Stress level's definitely high. 100% have difficulty sleeping at night. I think it's important to note that this affects the young and the old. No one's really immune to this at all. Overall, I think the morale is high, remaining positive, take it day by day, and I think that we will get through this.
I know there's going to be a lot of bad stories out there, and you're going to see that, but there's going to be a million great stories that come out of this, and I hope those get shared to the public, because ERs not only here at Dearborn, but throughout the country are saving lives, and that, to me, is a beautiful thing.
I think it's important for people at home who are doing such a great job with social distancing and people who are staying at home. I want you to actually hear about what's going on here in the hospital, because a lot of it isn't pretty, but we're working hard, and rest assured, we're trying to take care of your loved ones the best that we can, okay?
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here, and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.